All right, ready to dive in. Today, we're tackling something really intriguing, how ancient Greece, of all things, shaped Christianity. We're going deep with Edwin Hatch, this scholar, who really breaks down how much Greek thought snuck into that early church.
It's really wild, right? You wouldn't think those two worlds would have so much in common. But as you get into Hatch, it's like, whoa, Greek philosophy, their whole education system, even their rituals, it's all there in early Christianity.
Okay, so full disclosure, I'm already hooked, but for those tuning in, set the scene for us. How did a religion that came out of a Jewish context get so tangled up with ancient Greece?
Well, think about it. If you were starting a new religion back then, you couldn't just ignore the culture around you. And ancient Greece was a powerhouse. They were obsessed with rhetoric, persuasive speaking, like that was their superpower.
Yeah, it's like those courtroom dramas. Whoever delivers that knockout closing argument wins.
Yeah.
So, okay, they loved words, but how did that end up changing Christianity?
It's like the Greeks valued literature more than, say, studying nature. And that's still true today. Our education system is still built on analyzing texts, expressing yourself clearly. That's ancient Greece right there.
So fine, they were word nerds, but how does that translate to changing a whole religion?
It was everywhere. They were masters of allegory, finding hidden meanings in everything they thought. Even the poets were inspired by the gods to hide these truths. So naturally, when Christianity came along, they applied that same allegorical lens to the Bible.
Oh, wow. So they're reading the Bible like it's some kind of secret code. That's so different from how many people approach it today.
And it really changed how early Christians understood their scriptures. But let's go back to that rhetoric thing. The Greeks had these traveling teachers, sophists. They gave lectures all over, but they were performers. They used humor, drama to really grab the audience.
So like ancient stand-up philosophers, I can kind of see that. But what's the connection to Christianity?
The Christian sermon. Think about it. Those preachers who can hold a crowd spellbound. That tradition, it goes straight back to those Greek sophists. Hatch even describes them using all these techniques, humor, dramatic pauses. It's amazing.
Okay, mind blown. So it wasn't just what they said, it was the whole performance that mattered.
Exactly. How you presented an idea was as important as the idea itself. That really stuck with early Christianity.
So we've got rhetoric down. But the Greeks were also all about philosophy, right?
Big time. Think Plato, the Stoics, all these schools of thought tackling these huge questions about God, the soul, good and evil. So as Christianity moves into this world, you can't keep those ideas separate. They start to mix.
Okay, so you've got faith and reason colliding here. Did those two clash, or did they kind of, I don't know, blend together?
It was more like a fusion. Early Christians, a lot of them were actually educated in Greek philosophy. So they started using those ideas to explain and defend their own beliefs.
So they weren't just copying Greek ideas. They were using them to make sense of their own faith.
Exactly. And that blend of Greek philosophy and Christian thought, that's what really shaped early Christian theology. It's foundational stuff.
Do you have any specific examples of how those Greek ideas actually changed Christian beliefs? Like, give me the nitty-gritty here.
One that Hatch brings up that's super interesting is free will. This was huge E for the Stoics, and it made its way into Christianity. It changed how they saw sin, responsibility, God's role, and all of it.
So even today, that whole question of having a choice between good and evil, something we still debate, it has roots in those old philosophical arguments. That's wild.
Totally. And it's not just that one idea, the whole problem of evil, why bad things happen to good people. Those questions were being debated way back then, and Greek philosophy was part of the Christian response.
Okay, so it's not just some abstract influence. It's shaping how people understood these really fundamental questions about life and death and, like, the meaning of everything, heavy stuff.
No doubt. It provided these frameworks for understanding, even if the answers weren't easy. But there's another area where the Greek influence is crystal clear: rituals, specifically baptism and the Eucharist communion.
Wait. Are you saying that even our rituals are influenced by ancient Greece? How is that even possible?
You got to remember those mysteries we talked about before. The Greeks had these secret rituals involving purification, symbolic actions, kind of like initiations. Sound familiar? Well, Hatch argues that parts of those mysteries directly shaped how early Christians did baptism and how they understood communion.
So wait, the language we use today, like being sealed, illuminated through baptism, that's connected to those ancient Greek rituals. Wow.
It's really mind-blowing when you think about it. Something as simple as a ritual can carry traces of practices from thousands of years ago. It adds a whole other layer of meaning.
Yeah, it's like a direct link back to the past. That's powerful. So we've got Greek influence on philosophy, rituals, but what about just the everyday life of those early Christians? How did all this Greek stuff impact their community?
Hatch points out this really big shift that happened as Greek thought took hold. At first, those early Christian communities were all about how they lived their lives, their actions, their ethics. But as the Greek influence grew, the focus shifted from conduct to doctrine, from how you lived to what you believed.
So instead of just being good people doing good things, it became more about having the right beliefs in your head.
It was gradual, but yeah.
Yeah.
And he uses this great example, the Two Ways document, an early Christian text. It's all about practical morality, how to actually live a good life. Compare that to the later creeds, which were all about the specific beliefs you had to hold to be a true Christian.
That's a stark contrast. Makes you wonder which is more important, a good life or the right beliefs? What do you think?
Honestly, that's a question that's been debated for centuries. But Hatch does point out that even back then, not everyone was happy about this shift. Some people felt that putting so much emphasis on what you believed, on doctrine, was missing the point of what Christianity was really about.
It's almost like a battle between head and heart, right?
Right.
Like between belief and action. And it's a battle that people still have today, for sure.
Absolutely. And it raises the question, what really unites people in a faith community? Is it just about what they believe, or is it how they live, or is it some mix of both?
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of ancient Greece. They're obsessed with words, with persuasion, with finding hidden meanings. Christianity comes into this world, starts absorbing all these elements, and it changes in the process. But how did all this philosophy and rhetoric stuff actually change how those early Christians lived their faith day to day? Get specific with me.
To really get that, we need to look at their education system. The Greeks had this thing called the trivium, focused on two key things, grammar and rhetoric. And get this is where it gets super meta.
Meta. Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
When we think of grammar today, it's all about rules, sentence structure, that kind of thing. But for the Greeks, grammar meant studying literature, specifically the ancient poets, like Homer.
Wait a minute. So their grammar lessons were like poetry slam sessions. That's kind of cool.
It is, and it shows how much they valued understanding these texts, finding those hidden meanings, the allegories we talked about. They thought studying the great poets taught you about life, morality, everything.
So it wasn't just about like diagramming sentences. It was about learning how to think, how to interpret the world.
Exactly.
Right.
And the other part of the trivium, rhetoric, it wasn't just about giving speeches. It was about thinking clearly, structuring arguments, using language effectively. It was like a philosophy in itself.
Okay, so they're learning how to think and how to speak. No wonder they were such good debaters.
Right, and here's the kicker. Those skills, those ways of thinking, they didn't just stay in ancient Greece. They spread throughout the Roman world. And guess what? They influenced early Christianity.
All right, so all this grammar and rhetoric stuff, how did it actually change how those early Christians practiced their faith? Give me the details.
Remember that shift from conduct to doctrine we were talking about? That was partly driven by this Greek way of thinking. As Christians started engaging with Greek philosophy, they needed to express their own beliefs more clearly, more systematically.
Now, instead of just living their faith, they needed to be able to explain it, defend it, maybe even argue about it with others.
You got it. And that's where this Greek approach to education really kicks in. Christians started adopting those Greek methods of teaching, learning, debating. Imagine those early Christian thinkers writing those long, complex treatises about God, the Trinity. They were using the tools of Greek philosophy and rhetoric to make their case.
It's like they went through philosophy boot camp to become better defenders of their faith.
Kind of, yeah. And that, in turn, changed how Christianity developed. It put more emphasis on doctrine, on having a set of beliefs you could articulate and defend. And it also affected how Christian leaders taught and preached, how they reached out to people outside the faith.
Wow, so even something as basic as education played a role in how Christianity evolved. That's mind-blowing.
Right. It just goes to show you that ideas don't exist in a vacuum. They're always bouncing off each other, changing each other, creating new ways of seeing the world. And that's exactly what happened when Christianity met up with the intellectual world of ancient Greece.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
You've got this Greek world. They're obsessed with literature, public speaking, and digging for those deeper meanings. They've got this sophisticated education system, and Christianity is spreading right into the middle of it. What happens next?
Well, that's where those traveling teachers, the sophists, really come into the story. They weren't just teaching grammar and rhetoric. They were giving public lectures on all kinds of topics, philosophy, morality, even religion. And some of these lectures were super popular.
Like ancient Greek TED Talks.
Yeah.
With big crowds eager to hear the latest and greatest ideas.
You could say that. Hatch describes how these sophists developed all kinds of techniques to keep their audiences hooked. They were masters of storytelling, of humor. They used all this dramatic flair to make their points come alive.
So they were basically performance artists, using all the tricks of the trade to keep people engaged and entertained.
Totally. And that focus on performance, on captivating an audience, it had a huge impact on the development of the Christian sermon. Think about it.
Wait a minute. You're saying those early Christian preachers were taking cues from Greek sophists, the guys who were more into entertainment than spiritual truth? That's a wild thought.
It's more complicated than that, but there are definitely connections. Imagine you're trying to spread this new religion. You need to get the message out there effectively. So what do? You borrow and adapt techniques from the existing culture, including those used by the sophists.
Yeah, that makes sense. They were competing for attention, just like today, right? It's like the ancient world had its own marketplace of ideas.
Exactly. And Hatch gives some amazing examples of this. He talks about how some Christian preachers started using techniques right out of the sophist playbook to make their sermons more engaging, more persuasive. Humor, storytelling, even using gestures, they did it all.
So the Christian sermon, as we know it today, is partly a product of this cultural mashup, a blend of Greek performance techniques and Christian spiritual messages. That's fascinating.
It really is. And it's not just the techniques themselves, it's the whole mindset. The sophists were all about connecting with the audience, making your message relatable and compelling. And those ideas, they had a lasting impact on how Christianity was presented and understood.
Okay, so we've got this mix of Greek philosophy and rhetoric shaping Christian thought. But we also talked about how those Greek rituals, those mysteries you mentioned, had an influence too, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where things get really interesting. These mysteries were secret rituals that were popular all over the Greek world. They often involved purification, symbolic reenactments, and this whole sense of initiation into a deeper understanding.
So kind of like secret societies.
Yeah.
With their own special rituals and initiations.
Something like that. And Hatch argues that elements from these mysteries actually influenced how those early Christians did baptism and understood communion. It's pretty wild.
So these very basic Christian rituals, they got roots in these ancient Greek practices, rituals that were connected to pagan gods and goddesses. That's a bit of a mind bender.
That's what makes studying the history of ideas so fascinating. Nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything builds on what came before. And in this case, as Christianity spread into the Greek world, it absorbed and adapted elements from that existing culture, including those mysteries.
Can you give me some concrete examples of how those mysteries might have shaped Christian practices? Like, what are we talking about here?
Well, think about the language we still use around baptism, being sealed or illuminated. Those ideas come straight from the mysteries, where initiates would get a symbolic mark or seal as part of their initiation. And illuminated suggests a deeper understanding, a revelation, which was also a big theme in the mysteries.
So when someone's baptized today, they're not just participating in a Christian ritual, they're connecting with this whole line of symbolic practices that goes back to ancient Greece. It's like a hidden history of our rituals that most people don't even know about.
It really shows how ideas can travel through time, how they transform and take on new meanings. And it shows how Christianity itself was shaped by the cultures it encountered. It wasn't afraid to adapt and borrow to make those existing cultural forms its own.
Okay, so we've got these mysteries, these secret rituals that were all the rage in the Greek world, and they seem to have influenced things like baptism and communion. But can you tell me a bit more about what these mysteries actually were? What did people believe? What did they actually do in these rituals?
Well, that's the thing about mysteries, right? They were mysterious, they were secret, so we don't have the complete picture. But we do know that they were popular all over Greece and were usually associated with specific gods or goddesses.
Like each god had their own fan club with secret rituals, sort of like those exclusive clubs you have to be invited to join.
Yeah, kind of like that. And these mysteries were seen as a way to connect with the divine, to gain secret knowledge, special powers, even to achieve immortality.
Wow, that's some high-stakes stuff. Immortality was on the line. Can you give me an example of a specific mystery to make this a little less abstract?
Sure. One of the most famous ones was the Eleusinian mysteries. It was associated with the goddess Demeter and her daughter, Persephone. The whole thing centered around this myth about Persephone being kidnapped by Hades, the god of the underworld, and then her return to the world of the living.
Okay, so we've got a myth, a story. But how did that turn into an actual ritual? What did people do in these Eleusinian mysteries?
Well, the details were top secret, of course, but we do know that the initiates went through a whole series of rituals. Purification, fasting, they'd act out scenes from the myth. They even had a kind of sacred drama where the story of Demeter and Persephone was brought to life right in front of them.
So like an ancient Greek play, with actors and costumes and the whole drama unfolding.
You could say that, and the whole point of all this was to give the initiates this direct experience of the divine, to help them understand life, death, and rebirth, and to get them ready for the afterlife.
Wow, that sounds pretty intense.
Yeah.
So how do you connect something like that, with all the Greek myth and the afterlife stuff, to something like Christian baptism? That seems like a pretty big jump.
It's about looking for those shared themes, those underlying ideas that run through both. For example, both baptism and the mysteries involve this sense of purification, of being cleansed from past wrongdoing. And both involve a symbolic death and rebirth, a transformation of the person.
So even though the outward form of the rituals might be different, the inner meaning, the symbolism, could be similar.
Exactly. And that's how we can see the influence of the mysteries, not just on baptism, but also on the Eucharist, on communion.
Okay, explain that one to me. How does communion, the bread and wine, connect to these ancient Greek mysteries with all the gods and goddesses and myths?
Well, the mysteries often had this ritual meal, a shared feast, that was seen as a communion with the divine. And in communion, Christians share bread and wine, which represent Christ's body and blood.
So both rituals involve this shared meal that's about connecting with something sacred.
Exactly. And just like in the mysteries, communion was seen as a way to participate in the divine, to receive spiritual nourishment, and to strengthen the community.
So those early Christians, as they were figuring out their own rituals, they weren't just drawing on their Jewish roots. They were also taking inspiration from these Greek traditions, these mystery religions.
It's a perfect example of cultural exchange, and it shows how Christianity, as it spread, was able to adapt and include elements from other cultures while still keeping its own unique identity. It's a reminder that ideas and practices, beliefs, they rarely exist in isolation. They're always interacting, influencing each other, and creating something new in the process.
That's a great point. It's like Christianity was this evolving force shaped by all the different encounters it had along the way. And it makes you wonder, how did those early Christians figure out this tension between keeping their own beliefs and adapting to the cultures around them? How did they decide what to keep and what to borrow?
Well, that's a question that gets to the very heart of how Christianity developed and spread. And it's a question we'll keep exploring as we dive deeper into this amazing world of ancient Greece and how it influenced this faith that became, well, a cornerstone of Western civilization.
Okay, I'm already hooked. Can't wait to see where this journey takes us next.
It's amazing how deeply this allegorical approach soaked into the early church. It wasn't just a way to read scripture, it was like a whole way of seeing the world.
Whoa, so like everything became a symbol, like some kind of ancient Da Vinci Code where they're seeing hidden meanings everywhere they look.
Pretty much. Nature, history, even everyday objects, they could all point to these deeper spiritual truths. This way of thinking was especially big in Alexandrian Christianity, which blended Greek philosophy and Jewish mysticism.
So they were like seeing God's fingerprints all over the place. The world itself was a giant sacred puzzle box.
Exactly. It was like the world itself was a sacred text, waiting to be decoded. But that wasn't the only way the Greeks approached knowledge. They also had this strong tradition of philosophical inquiry, of using reason and logic to try and understand the world.
Right, we talked about all those philosophical schools.
Yeah.
The Stoics, the Epicureans. They were wrestling with some pretty heavy stuff, the nature of reality, knowledge, how to live a good life, all that.
And they each had their own answers, their own takes on those big questions. It's like they each had a different lens to view the world through, each lens giving you a different perspective, a different way of making sense of things.
Okay, so we have all this philosophical activity going on in the Greek world. But how did those Greek philosophical ideas start mixing with Christian thought? Was it a gradual thing? Or was there a specific moment where these two worlds, boom, collided?
It was probably more of a gradual process of encounter and exchange. As Christianity spread into the Greek world, it bumped up against this existing intellectual landscape. Early Christians, many of whom were educated and knew about Greek philosophy, started engaging with these ideas, trying to figure out how to articulate and defend their own beliefs in this new context.
So it's like a clash of worldviews, in a way.
Yeah.
Two totally different ways of seeing the world suddenly face to face.
Definitely. A meeting of the minds, for sure. And out of that encounter, a whole new way of thinking about Christianity emerged. A new way of expressing and defending the faith.
Okay, but how did those early Christians use Greek philosophy? Were they just picking and choosing ideas here and there, or were they doing something more creative, more transformative?
It was more than just borrowing. They were actively wrestling with these philosophical concepts, adapting them to their own understanding of God, Jesus Christ, and the whole Christian message. They were trying to make these Greek ideas work for their own faith.
So they were like philosophical remix artists, taking those Greek ideas, giving them a Christian spin, creating something new and unique in the process.
That's a great way to put it. And this fusion of Greek philosophy and Christian thought, it became a defining characteristic of early Christian theology. It wasn't about adopting Greek ideas wholesale, it was about finding ways to integrate them, to make them fit within the existing framework of Christian belief.
Can you give me some specific examples of how they did that? How did they take those Greek philosophical ideas and make them their own, make them speak to the core truths of Christianity?
Let's look at the concept of the logos. Remember how we talked about that as a kind of mediating principle between God and the world? God's reason or word, if you will.
Yeah.
Well, early Christian thinkers, guys like Justin Martyr, they used the logos to explain how Jesus Christ could be both fully God and fully human.
So they took this Greek philosophical concept, this idea of the logos, and used it to understand Christ. It's like they were using a Greek tool to solve a Christian theological puzzle.
Exactly. They saw the logos as the pre-existent Christ, the divine word that was with God from the beginning and that became incarnate, took on flesh in Jesus. They took this existing concept, this philosophical framework, and made it speak to their own beliefs about Christ's divinity and his role in God's plan.
That's pretty clever. That's like they were finding common ground, a shared language that allowed them to communicate their beliefs to people who were already familiar with Greek thought.
Exactly. It was a brilliant strategy. It allowed them to engage with those who were steeped in Greek philosophy while also expressing their own unique understanding of Christ.
And they used Greek philosophy to grapple with other theological puzzles as well, right?
Yeah.
Like the whole idea of the Trinity, this idea that God is one being but existing in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. How do you even wrap your head around that?
You got it. The Trinity was a really tough concept to explain, to put into words. But early Christian thinkers drew on Greek philosophical concepts, like substance and personhood, to try and make sense of this mystery. It wasn't about perfectly matching Greek philosophy onto Christian beliefs, but rather about finding conceptual tools that could help them articulate those beliefs more clearly.
So they were using the tools of Greek philosophy to work out their own theological ideas, to try to find language and concepts that would make sense to people who were steeped in Greek thought.
Precisely. They were wrestling with these complex theological ideas, trying to find the right language, the right frameworks that would allow them to engage in those philosophical debates, defend their beliefs, and share their faith with a wider audience.
So Greek philosophy wasn't just some outside influence, something they passively absorbed. It became a vital part of how Christianity itself developed.
Absolutely. And this fusion of Greek thought and Christian belief, it echoes even today. Many of the key concepts and doctrines of Christianity, as we understand them today, have roots in this early encounter with Greek philosophy. It's a legacy that shapes how we think about God, Christ, and the very nature of faith.
It's mind-blowing to realize how these ancient ideas still influence how we understand faith and the world around us. It's like these intellectual and spiritual threads have been woven into the very fabric of our culture.
It is remarkable. It reminds us that the history of ideas is never a straight line. It's full of twists and turns, unexpected encounters, and surprising transformations. And that's what makes it so fascinating to study. It's like piecing together a giant puzzle, where each piece reveals a new layer of complexity and depth.
Now, speaking of surprising transformations, Hatch really gets into how this Greek influence changed not just Christian ideas, but also the very structure of the early church. Remember how we talked about those early Christian communities being kind of loose-knit, bound together by a shared way of life?
Right. But as Christianity grew and spread, it needed more organization, more structure to function effectively. And guess what? We see Greek fingerprints all over that too.
Okay, how did that happen? How did the Greeks influence how the church was organized? Did they have some kind of ancient Greek organizational guru who came in and gave them a pep talk on efficiency?
Not quite. But think about those Greek philosophical schools we keep talking about. They were organized, weren't they? They had leaders, teachers, students, this whole hierarchy of knowledge and authority.
So they had a system, a structure for learning, passing on knowledge, keeping things in order.
Exactly. And that influenced how those early Christians thought about leadership within their own communities. They started adopting similar structures, with bishops, priests, and deacons emerging as leaders in the church.
So the church started looking a bit more like those philosophical schools, with a clear chain of command, a more hierarchical structure.
In a way, yes. And this shift towards a more hierarchical structure was also influenced by the political realities of the Roman Empire. As Christianity gained more followers, it had to interact with the Roman authorities, and having clear leaders helped make that easier.
So it's partly about practicality, being able to function within the Roman system, having someone who could speak for the Christian community, negotiate with the authorities, represent their interests.
Exactly. It was about finding a way to both preserve their internal unity and engage with the larger society. And this move towards a more hierarchical structure had a lasting impact on how the church organized itself, how it made decisions, and how it exercised authority.
Okay, so we have this new church structure emerging, influenced by both Greek philosophy and Roman politics. But Hatch also highlights another fascinating part of this transformation, the role of doctrine. Remember how we talked about that shift from conduct to doctrine, from how you lived to what you believed?
Yes. And as Christianity became more organized, it also became more focused on defining and defending its core beliefs. It wasn't enough just to live a good life. You also had to believe the right things, to hold the correct doctrines.
So doctrine became a way to keep people in line, to enforce conformity, to make sure everyone was on the same page, theologically speaking.
It's a bit more complex than that, but doctrine did become a way to define what it meant to be a Christian, to mark the boundaries of the faith. It was about distinguishing between those who were considered Orthodox Christians and those who held beliefs that were considered, well, heretical. It was about creating a shared understanding of what it meant to be a Christian.
So it's a way to draw a line in the sand, to say, this is what we believe, and if you don't agree, you're not one of us.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And this emphasis on doctrinal conformity, it really shaped how the church developed. It led to the development of councils and creeds, those formal statements of belief that outline the core tenets of the faith. These became the standards against which all other beliefs were measured.
So those early church councils weren't just getting together for tea and crumpets. They were debating and hammering out what it meant to be a Christian. They were deciding what was in and what was out.
Exactly. They were grappling with complex theological questions, trying to find ways to articulate and defend the faith in a way that was both true to Scripture and understandable to those who weren't Christians.
And all this was happening within this newly structured church, with bishops and other leaders playing a key role in shaping these doctrinal debates.
Right. It was a dynamic process with both theological and political forces at play. And the results of these debates had a lasting impact on how Christian thought and practice evolved.
So to put it all together, Greek thought didn't just influence what Christians believed, it also influenced how they organized themselves and how they exercised authority within the church. It wasn't just an intellectual influence, it was a structural one as well.
Exactly. It reminds us that the history of ideas isn't just about abstract concepts. It's also about how those ideas shape institutions, practices, and even the dynamics of power within a society.
Okay, so we have this fascinating picture emerging. The Greek world was all about philosophy, rhetoric, and this allegorical way of seeing the world. As Christianity entered this scene, it began to absorb and adapt these elements, changing as it did so. But Hatch doesn't just describe these influences. He really digs into the consequences of this cultural exchange, both the good and the bad.
He argues that encountering Greek thought had both positive and negative effects on the development of Christianity. It's a complex story filled with both opportunity and challenge.
All right, let's break it down. What were some of the good things that came out of this Greek influence? What did Christianity gain from this interaction?
On the positive side, Greek philosophy gave those early Christians intellectual tools and frameworks to articulate and defend their faith. They were able to engage in the philosophical debates of their time, to explain their beliefs in a way that made sense to people outside the faith.
So it helped them spread the message, to make Christianity more understandable and appealing to people who were already steeped in Greek thought.
Exactly. It helped Christianity move beyond its Jewish roots and become a truly universal religion, appealing to people from all walks of life, all intellectual backgrounds.
And Greek rhetoric, the art of persuasion, that played a positive role too, right? In shaping how Christians communicated their message.
Absolutely. It shaped how the Christian sermon developed, helping preachers connect with their audiences in powerful and engaging ways. Think of those early church fathers, like Chrysostom, who were known for their eloquence and their ability to inspire and move people with their words.
So Greek thought helped Christianity become both more intellectually sophisticated and more effective at communicating its message. It's like it gave them a whole toolkit for engaging with both the minds and the hearts of their listeners.
Precisely. But Hatch also points out that there were some potential downsides to this Greek influence. It wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Okay, let's get into the darker side. What were some of the negative consequences? What did Christianity potentially lose or compromise in embracing Greek thought?
One concern was that all this emphasis on Greek philosophy and rhetoric could lead to a kind of intellectual elitism within the church. It could create a divide between those who were well-versed in philosophy and those who weren't.
So it created a potential barrier to entry. Like you needed to be a philosopher to really understand and appreciate the faith.
It had that potential, for sure. And some of those early Christian writers worried that this focus on intellectual sophistication was steering the church away from its simpler, more heartfelt beginnings. They argued that true faith wasn't just about believing the right doctrines, it was about living a life of love and service, embodying the teachings of Christ in your actions.
It's that tension between head and heart again, right?
Yeah.
Between intellectual belief and lived experience.
Exactly. And this tension continues to play out in Christianity and in other religious traditions too. It's a question that keeps coming up. What's the right balance between belief and action? Between knowing and doing?
And Hatch also points out that the Greek influence on how the church was structured and its authority, well, that had its downsides too. Remember how we talked about that shift towards a more hierarchical system with bishops and priests and all that?
Right. That hierarchy, while it brought organization and stability, also had the potential to create distance between the leaders and the regular people, between those in power and those they were supposed to be serving.
So it could lead to abuses of power, to a kind of spiritual elitism where the leaders become disconnected from the needs and experiences of the everyday believers.
That was a concern, for sure. And throughout Christian history, there have been debates and reforms trying to address that tension, trying to find ways to balance authority and accountability within the church. It's an ongoing conversation about how to best structure and govern religious institutions.
So in the end, Hatch's analysis paints a complex picture, right? The Greek influence on Christianity was both a blessing and a curse, shaping the faith in powerful ways, both for good and for bad. It's like a double-edged sword, with the potential for both liberation and oppression.
Exactly. It's a story of cultures meeting, of adaptation and transformation, and of this ongoing struggle to find the right balance between faith and reason, between tradition and innovation, between the head and the heart. And it's a story that's still unfolding even today as Christianity interacts with different cultures and faces new challenges and opportunities.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from Greek philosophy and rhetoric to allegorical interpretation and the structure of the early church. We've seen how these Greek ideas shaped Christianity in deep and lasting ways. But one question that keeps coming back to me is, why? Why were those early Christians so open to these Greek influences? What made them want to engage with this different culture, with these different ways of thinking?
That's a great question, and I think there are a few key factors at play here. First, remember that Christianity was a new religion, just getting started in a world that was totally dominated by Greek culture.
So they kind of had to speak the language, so to speak, if they wanted to be taken seriously, to make their message understandable to people who were already steeped in Greek thought.
Exactly. They had to engage with the intellectual and cultural currents of their time. They couldn't just ignore the dominant culture. They had to find ways to interact with it, to make their own beliefs make sense within that context.
And they saw some value in those Greek ideas too, right? They weren't just trying to fit in. They were genuinely interested in what those Greek thinkers had to offer.
Absolutely. Many early Christians were educated in Greek philosophy and rhetoric, and they saw these as valuable tools for understanding and expressing their own faith. They believed that reason and logic could help illuminate the truths of Christianity, make them more compelling, more persuasive.
So it wasn't just about adapting to the culture around them. It was also about finding ways to strengthen and deepen their own understanding of their faith, to make their own beliefs more intellectually solid.
Exactly. And I think there's another factor at play here, the very nature of Christianity itself.
Yeah.
From its earliest days, Christianity was a missionary religion. It was driven to spread its message, to reach people from all cultures and backgrounds.
So they were willing to adapt to different cultures, to spread the word. to meet people where they were, intellectually and culturally.
In a way, yes. And this willingness to engage with other cultures, to find common ground, to build bridges rather than walls, it's part of what makes Christianity unique. And it helps explain why those early Christians were so open to Greek influences. They saw it as a chance to connect with a wider audience, to express their faith in new and compelling ways, and to ultimately spread the gospel further.
So it was a kind of strategic openness, a way to grow and thrive in a diverse world and make Christianity a truly global faith.
You could say that. And this openness to other cultures, this willingness to adapt and change, has been a big part of Christianity's lasting success. It's allowed the faith to take root in different places, to speak different languages, to connect with people from all walks of life.
Okay, so we've talked about how Greek thought shaped Christianity. But Hatch also points out that this exchange wasn't just one way. Christianity also had an impact on Greek culture. It wasn't just Christianity absorbing Greek ideas, it was a dynamic back and forth, a real exchange.
That's a great point. It's important to remember that this was a dynamic encounter, a mutual exchange of ideas and values. And as Christianity gained influence, it began to shape Greek thought and culture in subtle but significant ways.
So what were some of those ways? How did Christianity actually change the Greek world? What new ideas or perspectives did it bring to the table?
Well, one key area was ethics. Remember how we talked about those early Christian communities being known for their love for one another, their commitment to caring for the poor and the marginalized? Those were radical ideas in a world where power and status were so important.
It was about putting those teachings into action, right?
Yeah.
About really living out those values in a tangible, real-world way.
Exactly. And those values, which were rooted in the teachings of Jesus Christ, had a profound impact on the Greek world. They challenged the existing social order, that focus on power and status. They offered a new vision of human community, one based on love, compassion, and mutual service.
So they were shaking things up a bit, bringing in a new way of thinking about how we should treat each other, about what it really means to live a good life.
Absolutely. And this Christian ethic of love and service, it had a lasting impact. It inspired the creation of hospitals, orphanages, all kinds of charitable institutions. And it continues to inspire people of faith to work for justice and social change, even today.
So Christianity brought a new moral compass to the Greek world, a new set of values that challenged the existing social order and inspired people to act differently.
It offered a new way of seeing the world, a new way of understanding our responsibilities to each other, and a new way of living a life grounded in love and compassion.
And this Christian influence wasn't just limited to ethics, right? It also influenced Greek philosophy and thought, introducing new questions, challenging assumptions that had been around for a long time.
That's right. As Christian thinkers engaged with Greek philosophy, they started raising new questions and offering new perspectives. They challenged some of the core assumptions of Greek thought, and they introduced new ideas about the nature of God, the meaning of human life, and the possibility of life after death.
So they were adding their own unique flavor to the mix, broadening the scope of philosophical inquiry, pushing the boundaries of thought in new and exciting directions.
Exactly. They weren't just passively absorbing Greek ideas, they were actively shaping the conversation, adding their own insights and perspectives.
So it was a truly dynamic back and forth, with both Christianity and Greek culture influencing and transforming each other. It's like a two-way street where the traffic is flowing in both directions, creating this vibrant mix of ideas and perspectives.
It's a testament to the power of ideas, to how they can travel across cultures, challenge assumptions, inspire new ways of thinking, and ultimately reshape the world around us. It reminds us that even cultures that seem very different, with different beliefs and values, can find ways to learn from each other, to enrich each other, and to create something new and beautiful together.
And Hatch really emphasizes one particular Christian idea that had a huge impact on the Greek world, the concept of a personal God. Remember how we talked about Greek philosophy emphasizing this idea of a transcendent God, a God who was beyond human comprehension, a God who was distant, uninvolved?
Right, but Christianity brought a very different idea to the table. It presented a God who was not only transcendent, but also personal. A God who loves and cares for his creation, who interacts with humanity, who sent his son into the world to save us.
So it was a more relatable God, a God who was involved in the world, who cared about what was happening, who wasn't just sitting up there in the clouds contemplating his own perfection.
Exactly. And this idea was a game changer for Greek thought. It offered a totally new way of understanding the divine, not as some distant, abstract force, but as a loving father who desires a relationship with his children. It was a revolutionary idea that challenged many of the core assumptions of traditional Greek religion and philosophy.
And this idea of a personal God, it wasn't just some abstract theological idea. It had real practical implications for how people live their lives, right? It changed how they related to God, how they understood their place in the world.
Absolutely. It led to a greater emphasis on prayer, on personal devotion, on seeking God's guidance in everyday life. It inspired new forms of religious expression, like hymns and devotional writings that celebrated the love and mercy of God. It brought a new warmth, a new emotional depth to religious experience.
So Christianity brought a new warmth, a new emotional depth to the Greek religious landscape. It's like they were injecting some heart into a system that had become a little too heady, a little too focused on abstract ideas and philosophical arguments.
I like that analogy. And this emphasis on the personal nature of God, on the possibility of a direct relationship with the divine, became a defining characteristic of Christianity and has continued to shape religious experience throughout history.
Okay, so we've seen how this encounter between Christianity and Greek culture was a dynamic two-way street, with both sides influencing and transforming each other. But Hatch also raises this really important question. What does all this mean for us today? How do these Greek influences continue to shape Christianity in the modern world? Do they even matter anymore? Are they still relevant?
Those are great questions, and I think it's crucial to remember that the history of Christianity isn't just something that happened in the past. It's a living, breathing tradition that continues to shape and be shaped by the world around it. And those Greek influences, even though they happened centuries ago, are still part of that ongoing story.
So we're still carrying that Greek legacy with us, even if we don't always realize it. It's like this invisible inheritance that shapes how we think, how we believe, how we practice our faith.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to be aware of that legacy, to understand both its positive and negative aspects, and to really think critically about how it continues to influence our understanding of faith, reason, authority, and even the very nature of God.
So it's not just about celebrating the Greek influence or condemning it. It's about understanding it, wrestling with it, and figuring out how it continues to shape our faith today.
Exactly. And one key area where I think we see this Greek influence at work is in the role of reason and logic in Christian thought. Those Greek philosophical ideas about the importance of using our minds to understand the world, to explore theological questions, to engage in debate and discussion, those are still alive and well in many Christian circles today.
So we can thank the Greeks for all those theological debates and arguments that have shaped Christian history, all those councils, creeds, and theological treatises that we've been talking about.
They definitely played a part. And while those debates can be divisive sometimes, they've also helped to refine and deepen our understanding of the faith. They've pushed us to grapple with tough questions, to seek new insights, to challenge assumptions, and to ultimately grow in our knowledge and understanding of God.
So even those late-night theological discussions that make our heads spin, those have roots in ancient Greece. In that Greek passion for debate, for using reason to explore the mysteries of faith.
In a way, yes. And that legacy of intellectual inquiry, of using reason and logic to explore faith, is something we should both appreciate and continue to cultivate. It's part of what makes Christianity such a rich and intellectually stimulating faith tradition.
What about the Greek influence on how the church is structured and its authority? How does that play out in the modern world? Are those hierarchical structures that we see in many churches today, the bishops, priests, and so on, are those still reflections of that Greek influence?
Those structures, which emerged in the early church, influenced by both Greek philosophy and Roman politics, are still very much with us in many Christian denominations today. They've provided stability and continuity for the church, but they've also raised questions about power dynamics, the role of lay people, the need for accountability and transparency within religious institutions.
So those debates about church governance and leadership that we see today, those arguments about who has authority, who gets to make decisions, how power is distributed within the church, those are echoes of those ancient encounters.
Absolutely. And these conversations are still ongoing as the church continues to wrestle with questions of authority, representation, and how to live out its mission in a world that's always changing. It's a reminder that the church isn't some static institution. It's a living, dynamic community that's constantly adapting, evolving, and grappling with tough questions.
And what about that allegorical approach to reading Scripture? Remember how we talked about how the Greeks were obsessed with finding hidden meanings, with interpreting texts through allegory? How does that affect how we read and understand the Bible today? Are we all still running around trying to decode secret messages hidden in the text?
Well, allegorical interpretation, while it was super influential in the early church, has fallen out of favor in many circles today. There's a greater emphasis now on historical critical methods, on understanding the Bible in its original context, taking into account the cultural and literary conventions of the time it was written.
So we're more likely to take the Bible literally now, to focus on the plain meaning of the text, instead of searching for hidden symbolism.
There's definitely a stronger focus on understanding the historical and literary context of the Bible. But even so, the legacy of allegory is still present in the way we approach certain texts, in the way we look for deeper meanings and symbolism, in the way we connect those ancient stories to our own lives and experiences.
So even though we might not be reading the Bible as one giant allegory anymore, we're still looking for those deeper layers of meaning, for connections between the text and our own lives.
Exactly. And that desire to find meaning, to connect these ancient texts to our own lives, to see them as sources of wisdom and guidance, that's something we can appreciate even as we approach those texts with a more critical and nuanced lens. It reminds us that the Bible isn't just a book of rules or historical facts. It's a living text that can still speak to us in powerful ways.
And finally, what about that Christian concept of a personal God? That idea of a God who loves us, who cares about us, who wants to have a relationship with us. How does that influence how we experience faith today? Is that just a given now, or is it something we still struggle with?
That idea, which was so revolutionary in the Greek world, has become such a basic part of Christian thought and practice that we might not even think about it anymore. But it's still at the heart of how many people understand and experience their faith. It's about having a personal relationship with God, about seeking his guidance, about experiencing his love and grace in a real and transformative way.
So that personal relationship with God that many Christians value, that sense of closeness and connection with the divine, it has its roots in those early encounters with Greek thought, in those Christian thinkers who wrestled with the Greek concept of a transcendent God and found a way to bring that together with their belief in a personal God.
It's a fascinating example of how ideas can travel across cultures, challenge assumptions, and ultimately reshape how we understand the world and our place in it. And it's a reminder that even those ancient encounters continue to have a ripple effect on how we experience faith, spirituality, and the search for meaning in today's world.
It's almost like those early Christians planted a seed that's grown into this massive, complex tree. A tree with roots that go deep into the history of ideas and branches that reach out to touch every part of our lives.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it really captures the lasting impact of that encounter between Christianity and Greek thought. A legacy that still shapes and inspires us, challenges us, and provokes us, and invites us into a deeper, more meaningful engagement with our faith.
One thing that really stood out to me as we were going through Hatch's work is that this whole story about how Greek thought shaped Christianity isn't just ancient history. It raises important questions about how cultures interact, about how ideas change and transform, about what it means to be a Christian in a world where there are so many different beliefs and values.
Right. This is a story that's still being written, even today. We're constantly encountering new ideas, new ways of thinking, new cultural influences. And the question is, how do we respond? Do we shut them out completely? Do we embrace them without any hesitation? Or do we find ways to adapt and change, to bring these new elements into our existing beliefs and practices?
So it's like that encounter between Christianity and Greek culture. It's a model for how we can approach cultural exchange in our own lives, a way to think about how we interact with people who believe different things, who come from different backgrounds, who see the world differently than we do.
I think so. It encourages us to be open to new perspectives, to really listen to people who believe different things, to find ways to build connections rather than walls.
But it also warns us to be careful, right? To be aware of the potential pitfalls of cultural exchange, of how certain ideas can be twisted or used to manipulate and control others. It's not about just blindly accepting everything that comes our way.
You got it. It's about finding that balance. It's about being both open-minded and critical, finding ways to stay true to our core values, while also adapting and evolving as the world changes.
So this ancient story gives us some timeless wisdom for navigating the complexities of cultural exchange in our own lives. It's a reminder that encountering something different can be both enriching and challenging. And finding the right balance takes wisdom, discernment, and a willingness to engage in respectful dialogue.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's a call to engage with the world around us, to learn from those who are different from us, and to find ways to live out our faith in a way that's true to who we are and also responsive to the needs of our time.
Okay, so we've really explored how Greek thought shaped Christianity, but one thing I have to ask, was there any pushback? Did everyone welcome all these Greek ideas with open arms? Was anyone saying, hold on a minute, this isn't what Christianity is supposed to be about?
That's a great question, and it's important to remember that these changes didn't happen overnight or without controversy. There were definitely people who resisted this Greek influence, who saw it as a corruption of the true faith. They were concerned that all these new ideas, all this philosophy and fancy rhetoric, were steering Christianity away from its roots.
So this pushback against all the Greek stuff, it wasn't just a few people on the fringes. It was a real movement within the early church. There were folks who honestly believed that these Greek ideas were a danger to their faith.
Oh, absolutely. And it's really important to understand where they were coming from because it highlights the whole messy, complicated nature of cultural exchange. It's not always smooth sailing. You've got different values bumping up against each other, conflicting interpretations, people worried about losing their identity in the face of all these outside influences. It's complicated.
So it's a reminder that, yeah, cultural exchange can be a two-way street, but it's not always a joyride, right? There can be some bumps in the road, some detours, some unexpected obstacles along the way.
You got it. It takes careful thought, open communication, and a willingness to learn from each other and to challenge each other. It's about finding that balance between respecting differences and staying true to your own core values.
Okay, so you've got this tension going on between the folks who embraced all the Greek stuff and those who were pushing back against it. But in the end, the Greek influence kind of won out, right? It became a core part of Christian thought and practice.
In a way, yes, but it's not a simple story of winners and losers. It's more nuanced than that. Those early Christians who were engaging with Greek thought they weren't trying to become Greek. They were trying to figure out how to express and defend their own faith in a world that was deeply shaped by Greek culture. And in doing that, they created something new, a blend of Jewish and Greek ideas that became, well, a foundation for Western civilization.
So they took the best of both worlds. They figured out a way to bring together these two seemingly different traditions, and the result was something unique and powerful.
Exactly. They took those Greek ideas and adapted them, transformed them, made them their own. And this process of cultural exchange, even though it was messy and controversial at times, ultimately made Christianity richer and stronger. It helped the faith spread, grow, and reach a much wider audience.
So it's a story about keeping some things the same and changing other things, about holding on to tradition while also being open to new ideas. A reminder that even our most cherished beliefs and traditions can change and adapt as they encounter new ideas and cultures.
Perfectly said. And it's a story that's still happening today. Christianity is still a vibrant, evolving faith, constantly encountering new cultures and wrestling with new challenges.
You know, one thing that really jumped out at me in Hatch's book was how he connects this shift from focusing on conduct to focusing on doctrine, from a shared way of life to a set of beliefs to the rise of heresy in the early church. It's like that shift opened up a whole can of worms, leading to all these doctrinal debates and disagreements.
That's a really sharp observation. As Christianity became more and more focused on doctrine, on defining what was right and wrong belief, it also became more concerned with spotting and fighting those who had ideas that went against the grain.
So heresy became a bigger deal. It wasn't just about how you lived anymore, but about what you believed. And if you believed the wrong things, boom, you could get labeled a heretic.
You got it. Remember, in those early Christian communities, unity was mainly about a shared way of life, about following Jesus' teachings in a practical way. Love, compassion, serving others, that was the heart of it.
It was about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Right. But as doctrine took center stage, the focus shifted to what you believed, to intellectual agreement. And this created a whole new way of deciding who was in and who was out.
So if you didn't agree with the official doctrine, you were out. You were seen as a threat to the unity and the purity of the faith.
You were at risk of being branded a heretic, someone whose beliefs were seen as dangerous or just incompatible with the true faith. And that could have some serious consequences. It wasn't just about being excluded from the community.
Right. It wasn't just a theoretical debate. There were real-world consequences for people.
Exactly. Being labeled a heretic could mean being shunned by your community, being persecuted, even facing violence. And this fear of heresy, this need to define and protect orthodoxy, played a major role in how Christian thought and practice developed. It was a driving force behind all those theological arguments, those councils, those creeds we talked about.
So this whole concept of heresy, it's not just some abstract idea from theology class. It really affected people's lives and the whole shape of the early church.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that ideas have power. They can unite people, but they can also divide people. They can inspire, but they can also be used to oppress. As we study Christian history, it's crucial to keep in mind how these ideas played out in the lives of real people, how they shaped the course of history, and how they continue to influence our understanding of faith and belief today.
Okay, so we've got this rise of heresy, this focus on doctrine, these bishops trying to make sure everyone stays in line theologically. But I got to ask, what about the everyday Christian? Were they caught up in all this high-level theological debate? Were they all studying ancient scrolls, trying to figure out all the ins and outs of Trinitarian doctrine?
It's a good question. And while all those theological arguments were definitely happening among the church leaders and thinkers, the average Christian was probably more concerned with the day-to-day realities of life, work, family, their community. They weren't likely spending their days dissecting Greek philosophical texts.
So what were they focused on? How did all this doctrinal stuff affect their everyday lives? Did it even filter down to their level?
Well, for the average person, faith was probably more about lived experience than about intellectual agreement. It was about participating in the rituals and practices of the church, about living a life that reflected Jesus' teachings, about finding meaning and purpose in community with others.
So it was about putting those beliefs into action, about actually living out those Christian values in their daily lives, in their relationships, and how they interacted with the world around them.
Exactly. And while those doctrinal debates might have seemed far removed from their daily concerns, they did have an impact on how people understood and experienced their faith.
Can you give me some specific examples of how that worked? How did those big theological ideas actually affect the lives of regular people?
Sure. Think about the sermon. As Christianity became more influenced by Greek rhetoric, sermons got more complex, more intellectually stimulating. Preachers started using techniques they borrowed from the sophists, those Greek teachers of public speaking, to make their sermons more captivating and persuasive.
So those early sermons weren't just about yelling and scaring people. They were actually trying to engage their audiences, to make those theological ideas come to life.
They were using storytelling, humor, and dramatic delivery to make those theological concepts resonate with people, to make them relevant to their everyday lives. They were trying to connect on an emotional level, not just an intellectual level.
Okay, so they were kind of like ancient TED Talks, in a way. They were concerned with both the intellectual content and how they presented it.
Yeah, something like that. And this emphasis on engaging preaching had a big impact on how people understood and experienced their faith. It helped to connect those big theological ideas to their daily lives, to make them feel more real, more personal, more powerful.
And what about the effect of those doctrinal debates on rituals like baptism and communion? Did all those theological arguments about the Trinity or the nature of Christ actually change how people experience those rituals?
Well, think back to how we talked about those rituals evolving as Christianity became more influenced by Greek thought. They became more closely tied to the idea of intellectual agreement, of believing the right things. It wasn't just about the outward actions anymore. It was about what you believed on the inside, too.
So those rituals weren't just about the outward actions anymore. They were also about your inner beliefs, about affirming your commitment to a particular set of doctrines.
Right. So, for example, in the early church, baptism was often seen as a symbol of cleansing, of starting a new life, of becoming part of the Christian community. But as doctrine became more important, the emphasis shifted to the idea that baptism was also about affirming your belief in specific doctrines, like the Trinity or the divinity of Christ.
So it was like you had to pass a theological test to be fully accepted.
Kind of, yeah. And this change in emphasis had a real effect on how people experienced baptism. It became less about a purely emotional or symbolic act and more about making a deliberate intellectual commitment to a set of beliefs.
And the same thing happened with communion. It became less about simply sharing a meal and more about making sure you believe the right things about the Eucharist.
Exactly. In the early days, communion was mostly about sharing a meal, remembering Christ's sacrifice, and strengthening the community. But as doctrine gained importance, the focus shifted to the theological meaning of the bread and wine, to the idea that they represented the body and blood of Christ.
So it became more about the idea of transubstantiation, about the actual presence of Christ in those elements, about making sure you believed in that doctrine.
That's right. And this shift led to all sorts of arguments and controversies about what Christ's presence in the Eucharist really meant, and those debates continue in some Christian denominations today.
So those high-level theological debates that were going on among the church leaders, those arguments between bishops and theologians, they actually trickled down and shaped how people experienced even the simplest rituals of their faith.
Exactly. And it just goes to show that ideas, even those that seem really abstract, can have a real impact on how we experience life, how we see the world, and even how we feel.
That's a really powerful point. It means we can't just dismiss those theological debates as irrelevant to our lives. They shape how we understand things, how we experience our faith, and ultimately, how we live.
And those debates haven't gone away. We're still wrestling with many of the same questions that those early Christians grappled with. What does it mean to be a Christian? What do we believe? How should we live our lives?
So this deep dive into ancient history has actually given us some tools to understand what's happening today, to help us navigate the complexities of faith and culture in our own lives.
I think so. By exploring the past, we can understand the present better, and we can prepare ourselves to meet the challenges and opportunities of the future.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. This exploration of the surprising influence of ancient Greece on Christianity has been fascinating, and honestly, a little mind-blowing. Lots to ponder, that's for sure.
It's been a joy exploring these ideas with you, and I hope our listeners will be inspired to keep digging into this rich and complex history.
To everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you've gained some fresh insights and perspectives, and that you'll keep exploring that amazing world of ideas, both ancient and modern.